Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Now we are going to start the chapter number 2, which is the cell and its functions. To describe this chapter, firstly I would like to discuss this diagram, which is this particular diagram. In this diagram, we can see the cell membrane, which is actually the outer living boundary of the cell. The animal cell lacks a cell wall, so everything inside the cell membrane is the protoplasm, which is further divided into the cytoplasm and the nucleoplasm, and the nucleoplasm is then guarded by a nuclear membrane. And in the cytoplasm, we have a lot of things which are actually three types of food particles, namely the proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. Along with that, we have water and we have electrolytes. Water, it is actually, as we know, the human body consists of 70 to 85% of water, and the substances, the mainly food particles, they are either dissolved in the water or they are suspended in the water as solid particulates. Then ions, always remember this statement that cell is a bag of potassium. So main ion will be potassium ion, then we have magnesium, bicarbonates, phosphate, sodium chloride and calcium might also be present. And this main ion for the intracellular fluid is potassium, whereas main ion for the extracellular fluid is sodium. And these ions are very much important because they are involved in the balance of the electrolytes, and they actually are helpful in the transmission of nerve impulses and muscle fiber impulses. Now, proteins, they are 10 to 20%, and they are further divided in the structural proteins and the functional proteins. The structural proteins, they are the polymers of many individual molecules, and they are microtubules or either fibrillar proteins, which are collagen, elastin, which are present in tendons and ligaments. The microtubules are present in the cilia and flagella, and they actually maintain the mitotic spindle for the cells that are undergoing mitosis for the distribution of the chromosome between the daughter cells. Now we have the functional proteins. These proteins are very much important because they perform the function, and their shape is tubular globular. Main functional proteins are enzymes. Also, we have another functional protein, that is the hemoglobin, which is responsible for the carrying of oxygen and carbon dioxide, for the transmission of the oxygen to the cells and for the removal of the carbon dioxide. Now we have lipids. Lipids are actually a group of the substances which are non-polar in nature, and they are soluble in fat solvents. These fat solvents are either ether, benzene, or alcohol, and they are insoluble in water and other polar compounds. Our lipids are further divided into phospholipids and cholesterol. The phospholipid, it is involved in the formation of the lipid bilayer of the cell membrane, whereas cholesterol, it is involved in the maintenance of fluidity of the membrane. And the triglycerides are also there, which are also known as the neutral lipids, and 95% of the fat cells or the adipocytes, they store 95% of their portion stores the triglycerides, and these triglycerides are actually the storehouse of the cell, and they store this lipid content in the fed state, but they provide this lipid content as a source of energy in the starvation state. Now we have the carbohydrates, which depend in a large amount. We can say that they are 1% of the total cell mass, but in the muscle cells they increase to 3%, in the liver cell they increase to 6%. And the main form of the carbohydrates is the conjugated form. They are glycoproteins and glycolipids, etc., but they can be stored in their active form, that is the glucose, which provides energy, but they can be in their storage form, which is a glycogen, which is actually involved in the which is insoluble polymer of the glucose, and it is the storage form which can be depolymerized and converted into the glucose to perform its function, that is to provide nutrition. Apart from the organized structures, from the disorganized structures that we have studied, the cell also consists of organized structures, which are the intracellular organelles, and many important organelles are there. For example, mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of cell, provides ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell, and it is responsible for 95% of cell's energy requirements. Now we have membranous structures inside the cell. Main membranous structure of the cell is the cell membrane, which is the living boundary, and if it is ruptured or anything happens to it, the cell will die. Inside the cell, there are many organelles which are covered with the membranes. These membranous organelles are the membrane of endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, lysosome, Golgi apparatus, nucleus, etc. And the non-membranous organelles, they include ribosome, the cytoskeleton, intermediate filaments, etc. So now let us have a general overview of the cell membrane. As you know, this is a cell membrane which is composed of the phospholipids which have a bilayer, and these phospholipids, they impede the movement of water molecules. This is the interior, this is the mid portion, this is the exterior. On the exterior we have the glycolipids and glycoproteins, and then we have proteins which protrude all the way through the membrane, and they provide either the carrier, the channel proteins, which we will discuss later. And these protein molecules actually help in the movement of the molecules across the cell membrane, and they can also act as enzymes and second messengers, etc. This was an overview. Let us move towards the text. So cell membrane is actually the plasma membrane. It is thin, it is pliable, and it is an elastic structure. Pliable means it can move. This it is 7.5 to 10 nanometers in thickness, and different things are present here. Main constituent is the proteins, which are 55%. The rest are 25% phospholipid, which make the phospholipid bilayer, then 13% cholesterol, 4% lipids, and 3% carbohydrates, and carbohydrates from the glycocalyx. Now let us move towards the lipid bilayer, which is actually made up of phospholipid molecules. The basic lipid bilayer, it is composed of three main types of the lipids, which are phospholipids, the sphingolipids, and the cholesterol. Now the phospholipids, let me tell you, there is a bilayer of the phospholipids, and they have these phosphate heads and these fatty acid tails. These fatty acid tails are actually hydrophobic, and these hydrophobic tails, they face each other, and their hydrophilic phosphate ends, they appear on the periphery inside the cell and on the periphery outside the cell. And these hydrophobic that fear the water, they are on the inside, which whereas the hydrophilic, the phosphate heads which love the water, they are on the exterior or the external surfaces. So we have discussed about the phosphate heads, which are hydrophilic, they appear on the exterior. Fatty acid portion, which is hydrophobic, they appear on the interior. The hydrophilic phosphate portions, they constitute the two surfaces. One is the intracellular surface, that is towards the inside of the cell. Another is the extracellular surface, which is on the outside of the cell. The lipid membrane, it is actually, because it is made up of the lipids, so it is freely permeable to ions. It is not freely permeable to the water soluble substances, which are ions, glucose, and urea, but it is freely permeable to the lipid soluble substances like the oxygen, carbon dioxide, alcohol. Apart from the phospholipid, we also have another type of lipids, which are the sphingolipids, and these lipids are actually amino alcohols which are derived from the sphingosine. And like the phospholipids, these also have hydrophobic and hydrophilic groups. So now the main function that is performed by these sphingolipids is pass function, that is protection from the harmful environment, then transmission of the signals, that is from S, and A is for adhesion sites for extracellular proteins. Three functions are protection, adhesion, and signal transmission. Now the third molecule to be discussed here is the cholesterol molecule, and it is a steroid nucleus. It has a steroid nucleus and it is fat soluble. The main function of the cholesterol is to determine the degree of permeability and also controls the fluidity of the membrane. It provides permeability as well as the fluidity, whereas the sphingolipids provided protection, adhesion, and signal transmission. Now we come towards the proteins, which are actually 55% of the lipid bilayer. So the proteins, the proteins that protrude all the way through the cell membrane, these are the integral protein, whereas the proteins which are present at one side, either the extracellular or either the intracellular side, these are the peripheral proteins. These integral proteins are very much important because they do a lot of functions. One main function is they act as channel proteins, they provide channel, or carrier proteins that attach with the substances and allow their movement inside. They can act as enzymes and they can act as receptors, and the receptors are ligand gated or voltage gated. Whereas the peripheral proteins, which are on the periphery, that can be either outside or inside, mainly they are enzymes, and secondly, they can provide certain pores. So now here we can see that there are two types of proteins, the integral ones, the peripheral ones. The integral ones that protrude all the way through, they can be channel proteins, which do not attach with anyone but they provide a channel only, whereas the carrier proteins, they attach with the molecule, they have conformational changes, and they move the molecule either outside or inside. Then we have receptors. The receptors can be ligand gated or they can be voltage gated. Example is the second messenger, and they can also act as enzymes. One major thing that was discussed in the text is the glycoproteins. Sometimes the carbohydrate portion of the cell membrane, it interacts with the protein portion and they make a complex protein, that is the glycoprotein. Now we have the peripheral proteins. The peripheral proteins, they can act as enzymes or the controllers of transport of the substances via the pores. Now, on the exterior side, we saw a lot of protrusions. The protrusions were actually the carbohydrates which were either attached to the lipid portion or either the protein portion. The one that are attached to the lipid portion, they are known as the glycolipids, and one that are attached to the protein portion, they are known as the glycoproteins. Here you can easily visualize these ones which are these are the carbohydrates and they are attached to the lipid proteins, so they are the glycoproteins, and these carbohydrates which are attached to the phospholipids, they are the glycolipids. So the glycoproteins and glycolipids, they actually compose 3% of the total area of cell membrane. 55% are the proteins and 13% are cholesterol molecules, whereas certain 25% is the phospholipid. So, apart from the glycoproteins and glycolipids, sometimes the glycan, that is the carbohydrate molecule, they are attached to smaller protein cores, and such substances are called proteoglycans. Sometimes we also have a loose carbohydrate covering, which is known as the glycocalyx. Glycocalyx is mainly present in bacterial cells, but to provide a smooth surface to animal cells, it might also be present. Main function of this carbohydrate that are present on the outer surface, they provide a negative charge to the cell because carbohydrates are negatively charged. The other thing is they provide adhesion to the cells. Cell to cell attachment is provided by the glycocalyx protein carbohydrate covering. They can also act as receptors, and receptors which like the receptors of insulin, and when bound, this combination allows the glucose to be absorbed into the cell. And some carbohydrate are also involved in immune reactions. So we have the negative charge, we have role in immunity, receptors, and attachment or adhesion.